So the one thing that we can do straight away with this data for the fields that have been assessed is use it in the sustainable farming incentive. That's the right one. Yes. SFI, soil standard, and who better to talk it through than Ellen from Natural England.
I'll give it a go. So for everyone who hasn't met me, I'm Ellen. I recently joined the Catchment sensitive farming team, and I helped to advise the Cotswolds, which obviously includes this area, and Gloucestershire and the Vale. So yeah, I'm just gonna try and be quite quick and sort of talk you through how the data that you're gleaming from the testing can sort of be integrated into the SFI. I'm aware you've had a lot of PowerPoints today, so I'll try not to go too data heavy on the SFI things. So yeah, just to give a quick outline on SFI and the soil standards in particular. I'm just going to cover the arable and horticultural soil standards today, because obviously there's a lot of information to sort of get through, and this is hopefully just a key example of which is what broadly applicable to your farms, and how CSF can help you utilise that soil carbon data. So about the partnership, so CSF itself, Catchment Sensitive Farming, it's led by Natural England, which is a partnership with DEFRA and the Environment Agency. Our aim is to work with farmers and organisations, the cluster groups, our land management, in priority areas across England to improve. Originally, we just focused on water quality. Many people might know that as where CSF sort of stemmed from. We now cover quite a broad remit, so we also look at air quality, soil health, and natural flood management. So sort of part of why I'm here today is the expansion of CSF. So as you can see with phase 4, originally CSF's remit only covered these areas highlighted in red. So you can see sort of for the Cotswolds, it is essentially sort of the northeast Cotswold cluster area. It's the north of the Cotswolds. It's mainly around the even load catchment. We've now expanded into phase 5, where, as you can see, the majority of the river catchments are now covered and eligible for CSF advice. So that's where we are looking forward, and hopefully as we go on, our remit and our advisory services will expand more and more. So one of the reasons that everyone is here today is probably to try and tackle the very confusing time that we're going through in policy of the agri-transition. And this timeline by the CLA is quite useful in the fact that it's so complicated. This is the challenge that farmers are facing at the moment. These variety of schemes which are coming and going and being renamed, and it's almost slightly terrifying. But hopefully CSF is there to sort of remove some of this cloud, sorry.
Can you just say that is one of the greatest pictures?
Yes. Yeah.
I can't read it.
Yeah.
It means absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I really think it is, and I don't put it up there to scare anyone. Yeah, I think it is a really, really useful tool, not because anyone can actually understand it. I think the power in it is the fact that it is just, you can't understand it. You know, how is any farmer sat here today supposed to know exactly what they're eligible and entitled to when you've got this to compete with? Yeah, so obviously, as we all know, with the phasing out of BPS, we're going into the environmental land management schemes, of which our sort of predominant scheme, which is sort of the opening account for all farmers to apply for, is the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is obviously opened in June. I don't know if anyone in the room has applied or looked at the standards or anything like that, but I'll try and sort of cover it quite quickly, basically. But I think the most important one for people here today in the cluster is the local nature recovery scheme, which is to pay farmers for local actions delivered in a collaborative fashion. That has piloted, and we've had feedback from the pilots. And one of the most important things that I think they've recognised is the need for more resources to be stemmed into the local nature recovery scheme. So they've talked about improving connectivity with the wider partners that are involved, so incorporating local councils into it more, the river basin district plans, and essentially improving that connectivity to make the scheme itself more beneficial to farmers on the ground. This will launch in 2024. it's sort of similar, well, the similarity that they're pulling to it is the countryside stewardship mid-tier, which I know some of you may be in or may not be in, or maybe at least more familiar with. And the payments rates, when they release that, are going to be based on the current improved land management based option rates that we have at the moment for mid-tier. So that's sort of the similarity that we're looking at, but hopefully more co-design and more collaborative approaches. Obviously, as many of you are really familiar with here, we've also got the landscape recovery pilots, which you bidded for, and also touch wood, it is made wood, you will be successful in getting. So here, obviously, they're looking to support landscapes and ecosystem recovery, piloting with 10 projects, of which this will be one, and launching fully in 2024. So the Sustainable Farming Incentive itself aims to help farmers manage their land in a way to improve food production. Primarily, that's what farmers are here to do. We're here to produce food, but we want it to be in a more environmentally sustainable way. The payments enrolling on the scheme do follow public money for public goods. So they want to see that you're improving water quality, enhancing biodiversity, and mitigating climate change. The scheme will be administered by the RPA and open for BPS eligible farmers on the 30th of June. CSF's role in this is predominantly advisory. So a lot of the actions and the standards are something that CSF recommends anyway to improve soil health, to improve water quality and things. I don't know if you want me to go into more detail on the agreements themselves. So they're 3 years, they're reviewed annually, and as they release further standards, you can also apply and update your agreement as those standards are released. You can also increase from an introductory level to an intermediate level. So the idea is that as your farming system develops and the way that you manage your farm develops, your SFI agreement will develop with you. It's not going to penalise you anymore for the changes that you make on your farm that are environmentally sustainable. That's the idea anyway. So, sorry, I'll try to rush through. So why soils? Why are we all here today? Soils are the most intrinsic natural capital asset that we have. As farmers, we're entirely reliant on our soils. So that's why they focused on those two standards first, the arable and horticultural soil standard and the improved grassland soil standard. So obviously, as we've discussed here today, soil health, our soil structure, and building our organic matter, enhancing that soil biology is so important. So the way that the standards themselves work is you have an introductory level, which is paying £22 a hectare, and an intermediate level at £40 a hectare for the arable soil standards. So I'll briefly just go through this in terms of how it can help. So essentially there's 4 actions that you have to say that you're working at or working towards to be eligible. So you can select different levels. So you, on your parcels, you can be introductory on one parcel and intermediate on another. There is that flexibility. So essentially the actions themselves, action 1 to fulfill is a soil assessment and a soil management plan. Action 2 is testing your soil organic matter, 3 being adding your soil organic matter, and 4 green cover over 70% of your land over winter, and that's on the introduction level. Going up to intermediate is essentially the same. It's the same 3 actions, but you're adding a 20% multi-species cover crop in as well as action 4. So the soil assessment and management plan, assessing your soil type, texture, the structure of your soil and the biology, assessing risk relating to soil. Obviously CSF can help here, where we can look at your hydrological connectivity to water bodies, any runoff risks, triple SIs on your land, any shine sites, things like that, looking at wind erosion, nitrogen leaching. So in the plan, what DEFRA would like you to include is your soil type and structure, the composition of your soil. Many of you may have this information for your agronomist, so this might be things that you already have. Any risks and problems to address, how you currently manage the area, and your proposed management to improve your soil health. So this is an example from DEFRA, which is where your soil carbon data that you're all collecting now from your baseline surveys can be inputted. So they'd like to see your soil management plan being on a field by field basis. So here you've got some examples of the details that they want you to look at, you know, almost similar to a farm environment record that you might be putting into countryside stewardship agreements, sort of plotting out risk areas on your farm. And here is where you can input obviously your soil carbon data that you've retrieved now, just on a field by field, on a personal level. And you have to have made this soil assessment and management plan within the first year of your SFI agreement. And then obviously it can be dated, updated annually. So actions 2, obviously this is really key, organic matter and organic carbon, the relationship they have. So action 2 is testing your organic matter. So during your 3-year SFI agreement, each parcel has to be tested within the last 5 years. Obviously there's a bit of an overlap between agreements, whether you've already done that in the past 2 years. And action 3 is adding organic matter. Helpfully here, they've not been too prescriptive on how you're doing it. So applying organic manure, using green manures, catch crops, cover crops. Again, these are all things you're probably likely to already be doing. Chopping and leaving or incorporating straw into the soil, introducing grass or herbal lays, legume mixes, and adding these into the rotation. So this calculation here obviously is assuming, however, that soil organic matter is about 58%, soil organic carbon sort of as a caveat. But obviously this is a calculation that you can use where you've got your carbon data to estimate sort of the organic matter in your soils and incorporate that into your assessment plan. So that's something that, you know, you can do as well. And then action 4 for winter cover in the introductory level is just 70% of green cover. To protect your bare soil over winter. Again, likely something that many of you might be doing. And this can be a variety of options. Again, they're not being too prescriptive. They're trying to encourage people to do it and not sort of make it a hardwired situation. So autumn sown crops, your winter cereals, linseed or seed rape, any quick growing cover crops or green manures, and leaving the sort of weedy stubble. Their sort of idea is that you do have to have a sufficient cover to protect the soil over winter. But they're trying not to be too prescriptive and precise on it because they do want to encourage people to do this. And then how that changes in the intermediate standard is only 50% of the area to have green cover over winter, but 20% must also be a multi-species cover crop. And again, they're just trying not to be too prescriptive, trying to encompass different lays and things that people can add. So one of the things that you might be here to wonder about is how this fits in with your countryside stewardship. So at the moment, the guidance is pretty clear. As long as you're avoiding double funding and paying for the same option that you're already doing, they will welcome how this will be compatible. So it's important to think about the timing of your options, and that you're not going to be doing the similar outcome on the same area as land. So for example, if your parcels are in SFI, in the arable soil standard, you can benefit from a countryside stewardship payment of managing your hedgerows. And if you can work out which is more beneficial, so in 2023, the hedgerow standard will be coming out in SFI. If you feel on your farm it's more appropriate for you to be adhering to a countryside stewardship hedgerow option, and that's more profitable to you, that's absolutely fine. You can do that if you're still not doing that in SFI. So you can layer and stack the payments at the moment as long as you're not double funding. So certain CS revenue options will be automatically removed from the eligible area. So when you log on online, it's all going to be done online now, no more paper, I'm afraid. It will automatically work out for you based off your SBI what areas are eligible to apply for SFI. So if it knows that 50% of your parcels are enrolled in a countryside stewardship scheme, those won't be available for SFI. So that should hopefully remove some confusion for it, that the RPA will hopefully do it for you. And again, with rotational options, the area will also be automatically removed based on your current declaration. And once your SFI agreement starts, the rotational options can be moved around to work with any existing mid-tier options you've got. So also another what we're here for today is what your data can do that is also eligible under countryside stewardship, under ELMs, under SFI. Again, it's a similar story that the guidance is saying to avoid double funding, but you are able to benefit from private sector payments for carrying out the same actions. So carbon credits, you're allowed to apply for a carbon credit scheme, even if you're involved in SFI, even if you're involved in countryside stewardship, and similar with carbon accounting. FIPL as well, as long as the eligibility and compatibility requirements are met and there's no double funding. They welcome that private and public sector funding as well. And similar with local nature recovery and landscape recovery. So the data that you're gleaning from your carbon testing can also be used in a variety of platforms. Essentially, the government guidance is just to avoid that double funding. Yeah, so CSF itself, catchment sensitive farming, we can help by advising on how to ensure best practice, how to meet these standards. We can evidence your decision making, and obviously we can talk through compatibility with other schemes. I know I've sort of rushed through it today, it's a lot to take in, but there are opportunities out there hopefully to maximise what may seem like a lowly paid option in a scheme, when it's layered and stacked with, hopefully as more things progress, might start to make a lot more financial sense. But I appreciate not all the details out, and that's taking a bit too much time at the moment. And yeah, CSF's message generally is what the standards represent, so that's key here. We also offer, which I think many people don't know about, we offer free advice visits, which only cost you your time. A lot of them are contracted out to ADAS, so you're getting professionals on the farm for various half days to go through different themes. One of the themes being soil, key today, so do talk to us if there's anything that you want to go through as a back to basis on soil husbandry and your assessments and nutrient management. But yeah, sorry that was a bit quick and a lot of information, but please do talk to myself, or I manage the catchments with my colleague Roz as well, and we're both here to help, and we understand how difficult the transition is, and if there's anything that we can do to advise farmers, we really want to support you through that, so I hope that helps.
So I'll promise to be brief, because I can talk about this, I can go on and on and on, so feel free to just stop me if you need to. Yeah, key principles for the development of environmental markets in agriculture. In effect, the background to this piece of work from the NFU is that, we've heard a huge amount in, I guess, political circles, policy, media about these environmental markets that farming is going to deliver into. And there's a huge amount of focus on, okay, there's going to be all this demand for these markets, but no one really talking a huge amount, besides a few projects, pilot projects here and there, about how these markets are going to work for farming, how they're going to work in farming systems. And we were starting to see that trickle through from our membership. So actually, are we missing the boat? We're hearing a huge amount about these markets. We don't know how to navigate them or where they are. And we've heard about X, Y, and Z being approached by a project developer. What does that mean for me? So really what we've done is we've had a few years of working on different elements of nature-based solutions and in farming systems because of our climate change work with the net zero team, or work on ELMs and our environment team. And we thought, we'll pull it all together and arrive at some key principles. How do we make these markets that are developing work for farming? That's a key question here. We've launched a huge amount of work looking at this. And arrived at 5 principles. And the context really is that there is an agricultural transition plan. We know we're going through this historical period of restructuring for the industry at a time when, the phase out of BPS is going to drive structural change. But at the same time, there's these alternative environmental markets developing. And one key thing is that this is beyond carbon. We're talking about carbon, biodiversity and water. And one thing we know is that they're in their early stages of development. And that's something we always have to remind people, that these are nascent new markets that are just starting up, still being figured out. There are no kind of vibrant live markets out there that people are trading on readily in nature-based solutions. There's some promising examples of it emerging here and there, but nothing scalable. And this is about how do we achieve scale in these markets so all farmers can participate rather than just the few that are situated in the right place. And if structured correctly, these markets could provide an attractive source of diversified income. And we know that's going to be increasingly important going forward. But if not, they carry significant intergenerational risks, because a lot of nature-based solutions and these markets can't be traded over 1 or 2 years. Nature doesn't work in 1 or 2 year cycles. We're talking about multi-decade agreements, and that has huge implications for farms. So what we've done is we've arrived at 5 key principles, which If they're met, we think they could help shape the development of environmental markets that are suitable for agriculture, for the sector to engage in a meaningful way. And what I'll do is I'll talk through these 5 key principles and basically highlight the risks that we're trying to address, some of the opportunities if these risks are, if these principles are met, and some of the recommendations that sit beneath each principle. And again, it'll be a very whistle-stop tour. So just pick me up afterwards if you want to talk about this in more detail. And the idea here from us at the NFU is we're putting this out there as our opening position, with the recognition that, you know, we need the feedback, we need the engagement externally from people to help us understand how all this is going to work. And so we can help them shape these markets from an early stage. So if anyone in the room has any thoughts after this talk, just come grab me. And actually no one leave until you've spoken to me, because I need everyone's comments to help inform this piece of work. So we're doing loads of external dialogue and discussions with government, industry stakeholders, banks, to try and insurers to figure out how all this is going to work. We'll start with the first principle. So environmental markets must work alongside the domestic production of food, energy and fibre. So there is a concern in the industry that there could be large-scale displacement of food production due to land sparing. Now, the reason that comes about is because at the moment, when people talk about environmental markets, it's very much about tree planting or about peatland restoration. And there's a big question mark for farming about actually how does this work alongside productive farming systems? Where's the land sharing aspect of all of this? How do we embed some of this into the farming system and into farming practices? So really it's to put out there that, look, we need to also focus on those nature-based solutions that can work within the system. What we don't want to see is leakage or a displacement of the environmental footprint from domestic agriculture abroad, because you end up with a lose-lose. If you rely more on imports, you're basically exporting our environmental footprint, and you're actually undermining food resilience in the UK and undermining domestic industry. And we don't want to see local food systems degrade. So there are opportunities in land sharing, and that could help improve the financial resilience of the whole farm, and enable greater investment into the entire farming system if it works. And there's a range of recommendations we have around best practice frameworks, a government accreditation body, an appropriate tax system, robust legal frameworks, and effective market monitoring. And these are kind of detailed more in the next 4 principles, so I won't go through them now. But the whole point being that actually in the round, if some of these recommendations are met, we could end up having a good balance between environmental markets and engagement in those alongside food production. So how do we balance a lot of these competing demands on land? That's coming about. There's a key point we make in here that farmers should consider their own transition to net zero, their own obligations to the supply chain in the future, potentially, their own potential regulatory requirements. That might mean they need some of those offsets on farm before they consider selling in the open market. So sometimes the market's talked up, you know, I'm going to sell in the market. But what if in the future you need those to sell in the supply chain as a condition of market access to demonstrate your environmental performance on farm? How's that going to work if you sell off those offsets so someone else counts them towards their own business? And that's something we're asking our members to think about, future-proofing their own businesses before they look to engage in these markets. Principle 2 is that public policy and government initiatives must support the development of private markets. It's picking up on the point just made that actually members are telling us that with the fast evolving environmental policy landscape, thank you for the slide, the really confusing slide, and we know it's really undermining the ability and confidence for farmers to engage in any of these markets. So what does it mean if you try to sell your soil carbon for ELMs? Will you be able to enter ELMs in the future? What does it mean for future regulation? We actually don't know. And even though in principle, there's been a positive sign that in principle, SFI supports the stacking of carbon, but the actual practicalities of that are still unknown. And the idea here was that we know from DEFRA, the reason that statement has been made and that compatibility has been built in is so the private sector is crowded out or put off from engaging with farming, because they won't think, oh, SFI is going to stop us doing anything here. But a lot of the ownership on trying to figure out the additionality on this is being put on the private sector. So actually, how would you stack on top of SFI? How would it work? And we think there's more that government can do in that space to provide some clarity, because ultimately that's where farmers are going to look. They're not going to rely on just the private sector company saying, oh, it'll be fine with SFI if you do this. They're going to look for assurance from the government as well that actually both can work hand in hand, and there will be additionality requirements with how they're set out. So we think there is an opportunity, and what we don't want is a singular focus on one environmental outcome. So it can't be all carbon, 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 because we know biodiversity is coming higher up the agenda, we know water is coming higher up the agenda. How do we get a balanced provision of ecosystem services, and how is that packaged up and sold in the market? Because that's really where you're going to get the integrity and enable farmers to deliver for the environment in a way that there's not backlash further down the line. But the key thing we do need to see here is stacking and blending. So we know the economics of SFI don't add up. And we always hear time and time again that what we need to see is the ability for farmers to blend and stack ecosystem services to make this all economical. And so one thing we're working with government on is to say, actually, how do we get this stacking on the ground and the private sector to understand how that stacking will work? So we have 4 recommendations. ELMs need to support private revenue stacking and blending, and all environmental policy generally should have some impact analysis done on how will emerging environmental policy impact environmental markets and their emergence, because that's going to send clear signals to farmers selling in these markets and buyers in terms of what that's going to do in terms of engagement with these markets to prices. The government should provide market oversight through an accreditation of best practice guidance. So we do think there's a role for a government body to really clearly signal which private sector offsets are compatible with government initiatives, because that's what's going to give confidence in the market for the farmer. We should minimise and remove.
We're not screen sharing this.
Oh, okay.
Carry on talking.
We should minimise and remove regulatory and tax barriers. So one thing we have put in our paper that underpins this is there is a need to look at tax reliefs, for example. So where you have capital reliefs on farmland, that will need to be extended to environmental land only where that land is ancillary to the core farming business. So what we don't want to see is a flooding of non-farming interests coming into agricultural land. But what we do want to do is remove a barrier from engagement in environmental projects, which is those capital reliefs. So we need clarity around that. And that's also going to prevent the impact on tenanted land, because at the moment there's an incentive to take land back in hand to protect your capital relief. So we don't want to see an impact on the tenanted sector, and therefore that's something that needs looking at. And we think there's a role for Green Finance Institute. So things like the UK Infrastructure Bank, the British Business Bank, have a role to play in scaling up finance at this early stage of the markets to get finance flowing effectively. How do you finance the farmer collectives, the project intermediaries that are going to get this off the ground? Some of the banks are really going to struggle with that. So we do need some of this development finance, this project finance flowing through. And there's a big gap there actually in terms of how we get that finance to projects. Principle 3, environmental markets require clear rules and standards to allow farmers and buyers to participate with confidence. A lot of our members will say this is one of the most important principles. How do farmers have confidence in what they're selling, and how do buyers have confidence in what they're buying? And at the moment, actually, it's a really confusing landscape out there. There's technical standards are fast evolving. There's a huge amount of complexity. It's quite fragmented in the way it's developing, and that's expected in any nascent early stage of a market that's developing. But for a farmer, it's quite confusing. And there's risks with that, because what we don't want to see is that projects that farmers enter into now are discredited and don't stand the test of time. 5-10 years down the line, the science moves on, social expectations move on, and suddenly the whole greenwashing accusation comes out on farming credits. Say, well, actually, that's not delivering anything. There's a huge amount of leakage. Actually, when you do a life cycle assessment, that's not actually sequestering any carbon. It's not helping climate change. So we need to see some integrity around this. And the reason is because in a global market, we know we're never going to compete on cost. We're never going to sell offsets based on cost, because it's just cheaper to do it in other parts of the world. What we're going to compete on is integrity. So we need standards that can demonstrate integrity. And we know that's why private finance is shifting back to the UK, because of the whole issue of greenwashing abroad and poor quality offsets. They're saying, actually, we want integrity. We want clear rules that we can follow. And therefore, that's where we do have an advantage if we can get these markets functioning properly. Our 4 recommendations here are that we need widely recognised standards on measurement, reporting and verification. We think the government has a role to play in actually developing some of those benchmark standards on soil, on hedgerows, on all the assets you see on farm. We need that coordination, because the government sometimes will say, well, actually, the market will converge to best practice. And we say, well, actually it won't, and definitely not in the timelines we're looking at to deal with things like net zero and biodiversity delivery. So what we need is someone who's steering the ship, especially because these markets aren't often true markets. They're kind of played out as though, you know, these are markets like you see in the city, but they're not. A lot of them are a response to compliance. They're a response to public policy. They're going to be massively shaped by the way government sets public policy. And therefore, it makes sense by extension that government should play a role in shaping the standards that sit in these markets. But there should also be space for the private sector, the voluntary sector, to develop and innovate, because that's where the innovation is going to happen. So what you end up having is effectively your best practice standards, which is shaped by government working with industry. Say, well, actually, this is kind of almost your high standard. Then you have a huge amount of voluntary standards that are innovating and meeting specialist market needs. You might focus on co-benefits of the carbon offset, delivering for biodiversity. And then the farmer decides, depending on their risk and reward appetite, say, well, actually, I'll go for that standard, the high integrity standard that's endorsed by government, but it might pay me a bit less, but I like the security of the integrity that underpins it. Or I'll go for a voluntary standard, slightly high risk, but I can compare the two, and that fits better with my system. I'm happy to take a bit of a risk, and I'll take the return on that. But we need that coordination piece. There's a piece in the paper about legal agreements, which we can share the paper with the group. So I won't go into it now, but we know from members that the legal landscape is really uncertain in all of this. What does a good agreement look like? What should our members be looking for in their legal agreements? And that's something our legal team are looking at. We need clear mechanisms to manage the risk of underperformance and non-delivery. So at the moment, you have these buffers, you know, this credit reserve of 20, you produce more than what you're going to sell, that 20% extra to deal with permanence risk. But that's really expensive because it's not cheap producing nature-based solutions. There's a huge amount of investment that goes in. And that's a huge transaction cost for this whole thing. So is there a role for government-backed insurance schemes, for example, that could play a role in mitigating some of that permanence risk? So in practice, what would happen is if you don't deliver on your carbon yield because of an impact that's outside of your control, pest, disease, droughts, is there a carbon, would the insurance pay out for the replacement cost of those offsets through a carbon bank or a biodiversity bank or something that's set up, and buy those replacement ones to ensure permanence? And that will help bring down the transaction costs. We think there also needs to be mechanisms to manage the reliable flow of payments over the term of the agreement for farmers. So if these are multi-decade agreements, is there a role for insurance to make sure if the buyer defaults, the farmer will still be paid for the lifetime of that agreement? And the buyer might say, well, actually, I'll put the money all up front in an escrow account. But then what happens if there's payment triggers throughout the period of the agreement? Who pays? How do you manage that risk? And in practice, there might be a balance of an insurance proposition alongside an upfront lump sum payment that's locked up in an account. Principle 4 is that markets should be accessible across a range of farm sizes, tenures, and business structures. We think actually the way these markets are emerging at the moment, they're great for if you're a large estate, you've got the resources, the advice, you can get a specialist consultant in, you can get yourself mapped up, you can evaluate your natural capital, fine. And it's the transaction costs you can stomach and do all the project finance work. And then it's easier for the buyer to deal with you. You're dealing with one person, you're dealing with one asset, and the transaction costs are lower. But that's missing a trick on most of the agricultural sector. How do you get the small and medium-sized farms engaged in this? How do you get the tenant farmers engaged in this? And actually, at the moment, there's a huge question mark around that because of the huge costs of aggregating small parcels of nature-based solutions. It's really difficult to do, and it's something we need to crack in terms of how we can aggregate those if we're going to see meaningful investment in nature-based solutions at scale. And there's a huge question about the role of tenants in all this, because we know landowners anecdotally are taking land back in hand. And what we don't want to see is tenant farmers' role being more akin to being an environmental land manager or contractors with no security of tenure. We know tenanted land plays a huge part in the food production system, and therefore we need to protect how that operates in this space. And there are opportunities to look at new aggregation models around farmers cluster groups. And there can be new risk and revenue sharing agreements between tenants and landlords, and that's something we look at. Actually, what reform do we need in that space to make sure tenants and landlords can have meaningful revenue sharing agreements. And we know it's the small, medium and tentative farms that are particularly exposed to this transition. And therefore, really, they need to be able to access this really important source of diversified income if we can get this off the ground. Now, I won't take you through this because in the interest of time, but in a sense, it's summarising what I've just said. We think there needs to be a big focus on financing farmer collectives and clusters, and government should support that financing to really help scale this up. In effect, they need to be at the core of shaping these markets rather than markets developing and then imposing, this is what you need to do. We just don't think that's going to achieve meaningful scale. We think the government-led green finance institutions that I talked about can play a huge role in structuring the demand side. So how do you pool finance to put into this? But also connecting that to helping structure the supply side. How do you pool the projects on the supply side? Because it all needs to join up. And we think there needs to be new best practice frameworks for between tenants and landowners, and that's something we're looking at. And it's that's one of the most challenging, difficult areas in all of this, the role of tenants, and it's something we're really working hard and scratching our heads on how we can crack that. Finally, principle 5: farmers must be fairly rewarded for the delivery of environmental goods. We know there's a huge amount of high-loaded, front-loaded costs for these projects. And a lot of the revenues are much further down the line. They're backloaded because they're all linked to outcomes and based. And that's a huge cash flow risk for farmers. How do you put all this money up front and then wait for these promised revenues much further down the line? And we know there's all these issues of risk of default, late payment, breach of agreement, and farmers not receiving a fair proportion of project revenues. So that's something we're trying to deal with. So how do we get to these fair agreements? We think that payment rate should fairly reflect the cost of delivery and incorporate a suitable profit margin or a fair share of the value add for farmers. Effectively, some of this is a response to the huge focus on things like reverse auctions. And we're saying, no, that's a race to the bottom. You can't have a hard negotiation on a nature-based solution because it's not a long-term incentive. You might negotiate a great rate for yourself in year 1, but you're not providing the incentive for 30 years of delivery, especially if the economics of all of this flip with huge amounts of inflation, climate change could affect the whole economics of some of these agreements. So really, we think in practice, this will need to be more of a collaborative endeavour between the person delivering, the farmer delivering the nature-based solution and the buyer on the other end. And so we think projected costs need to take into account uninsurable costs. So there should be a stress test on payment rates to really make them future-proof. So what happens if the economics flip? What happens if there is a drought year? Will the payment rate still provide an incentive? There should be payment review mechanisms over the term of the agreement. So there should be trigger points linked to inflation and other measures. And we think there should be scope to actually, it shouldn't be all about linking payments to outcomes. There's a whole load of industries out there where you don't just pay once the job is done. There's more of a collaboration, there's risk sharing. You don't load the risk on the farmer. You say, actually, we'll pay for partial outcomes, we'll pay for actions that have been conducted throughout the term of the agreement. And that shows more collaboration. And then maybe we'll pay a huge amount more at the end when the outcome is realised. But there needs to be a more equitable share of payments to help meet some of that cash flow risk as well. And we think the government has a role to play in showing and providing some transparency in these markets. So what are these markets? How are they developing? What are the kind of payment rates that are being offered? What are the kind of deals? And initially, it might just be a broad level reporting on these markets to help build transparency and trust. Over time, you might have more sophisticated exchanges that develop that help with price discovery, that kind of thing. And finally, we have a line on scope 3. So we're starting to see contracts coming through where there's requirements on farmers to deliver certain environmental outcomes to meet supply chain scope 3 commitments. Essentially, what we're saying is if the farmer is required to put in a long-term land use change, that should be a separate agreement to the commercial agreement on farm, because commercial agreements for farm produce don't last that as long as that land use change agreement would last. So the economics don't tie up. You can't pull them both together because a few pence premium or a few pounds premium on your agricultural output isn't realistically going to pay for the lifetime of that land use change. That should be a separate agreement. However, if the payment is incentivizing efficiency in production, a change in the actual farming system that's directly linked to the production, then there may be merit in offering a premium in the price because it's directly linked and it's helping the farmer transition in their system. And so there could be merit in directly providing a value incentive in the agreement for agricultural produce. So that's our kind of key round robin. What we're looking to do with this now is we're doing lots of external engagement. So if anyone wants to speak, reach out, and we're happy to have a conversation to help refine our understanding on this and deliver that message to government, to industry, to members in terms of how we all need to position ourselves and how these markets work. We're continuing policy deep dives into particular areas like tenancy, tax, scope 3, aggregation, some of these real challenging areas that we need to crack. And we had our farmer group cluster workshop in July, which was just recently, which was really informative. And today's been brilliant to build on that. But again, it's a key piece we're trying to take forward with a whole load of industry players. So thank you.
That's pretty good.
All right.
Yeah, let's go.
All right, everyone, this is going to be really short and sharp because there's a lot to say about the UK Farm Soil Carbon Code, and we are just in the process of sort of finalising our NERF project, which was in the first round of NERF projects. We've got one more month to go, and we've got a whole bunch of outputs about to be ready in about 2 weeks' time. So now's a really bad time to be delivering anything. But basically, our objective was to bring some clarity and consistency and maintain integrity in the UK farm soil carbon marketplace. We have done extensive stakeholder engagement and developed some critical pieces of market infrastructure. So the outputs that you can find that do exist already, if you go to the Sustainable Soils Alliance website, they are part of the consortium and they are hosting the website with all the information. We have a lot of papers up there. We have had a paper accepted, which is a comparative analysis of the 12 global carbon codes that we selected that could potentially be used within the UK's marketplace. And then after the analysis, we've got lessons learned and things like that. So what we've done is we did the paper, did all the research, and then we went out to stakeholder workshops and consultation groups and basically asked the market, what are you looking for? What are farmers looking for? And what are projects looking for? So there's many projects in the market that exist already, but they don't really have much integrity because they are not tied to a code as such. And some of them are making or selling snake oil, potentially. So what we got back, what the feedback was that rather than having a set code like the Woodland Carbon Code or the Peatland Carbon Code, what we needed to develop for the UK marketplace was a set of minimum standards that projects could then create their own codes that fits in. So we're basically creating a baseline and saying you can build the project in the frame that you would like, but these are the minimum standards that are the lowest common denominator for the UK marketplace to maintain integrity. This will cover a whole huge set of criteria, including measurement, permanence, additionality, leakage, and we're also going to create a governance framework for that. And then there'll be a route map to an open access community code that we hope to build onto that would be aligned with the minimum standard we're creating and can be used by new entrants and small scale projects. Okay, so
would our 36 farms be eligible if it's ready right now to use the community code so we could go and take it?
So the problem with the code is that you also need ownership of things like a registry and the auditing procedures and things like that. So whilst we can build a community code, there does need to be some ownership. I do. So that's what we're currently in consultation about. So we are drafting what we, as the consortium, perceive to be the minimum standards that either based on global codes or based on the UK marketplace, based on what we know about the UK. So our consortium consists of a lot of soil scientists, senior researchers and policy, a whole big consortium. So what we're going to do is go out to a stakeholder engagement on the 18th and the 25th of August. we're going to say, right, this is what we've developed. Here is our guidance framework. This is the context for each of the points. This is what we state should be the minimum standard. What do you think? A bit like what Rohit was saying about come and rip it apart and tell us what you think and be involved. The whole purpose of this consortium was to be as collaborative and transparent as possible, have as much open access and get everyone on the same page and working together in the same direction. So that's the plan. So I'm sure you've all read the slide by now. And as I said, there'll be 2 consultation groups and then a public stakeholder event in early September, and everything can be found on the website. And if anyone has any questions.
Introduce myself. Tim asked me to be here, and we lecture from Dalesford. But I work for Trinity AgTech. We developed the next generation of sustainability tool. So we look at we take a holistic approach on your farm. So it's not just a carbon calculator. We look at biodiversity and water protection. It's basically a step onwards from the first generation of carbon calculators that are out there. So we use the latest IPCC methodology. We work to an ISO standard, and that's been developed alongside a panel of 35, our scientific board of 35 members. So the idea is to make it as scientifically robust as possible. As and when scientific knowledge and understanding evolves, the tool evolves, and we've already seen changes in the methodology since we first developed the product. So by looking at the holistic approach, we're showcasing absolutely everything you're doing on the farm, not just carbon, and we want to get away from sort of carbon tunnel vision, as we call it. So really useful management tool in its own right. If you then want to go on and trade natural capital, we can facilitate that. We have another company called Trinity Natural Capital Markets, which Louisa, my colleague, works for, and that's very much a two-way exchange. So we're not a brokerage, we're not selling the credits for you. We're giving you a platform, we're giving you the financial and legal infrastructure to do that. You price them, market them as you see fit. And if you use things like biodiversity, your nitrate leaching score, things like that, to add value and provenance to your credit. So the idea will be you market yourself as North East Cotswolds farmer cluster. You've got a fantastic story to tell. You're very credible, so therefore you can charge whatever it might be. And we've already sold the first lot of credits, but we haven't. But our users have. So the Green Farm Collective have made their first trade. They charged £100 a tonne or £100 a credit because of that biodiversity score, because of that provenance. So it's very much there for the taking. There's no obligation to sell or trade. It's still a really useful process to go through to do that benchmark. But that's what we can offer. Obviously, we'd love to work with you. So there we go. That's my elevator pitch.
Our business is digital twins, as it said on the video. So we fuse all the data sets that we can get our hands on. So existing data sets like CEH, soil grids, etc. Fuse that with remote sensing from radar and satellite to make models, digital twins of the land, to measure and analyze how carbon, how water, soil erosion, and soon biodiversity behaves. And we're working with banks, food companies, to increase sustainability in supply chains, and then looking to work with farm clusters and states as well. We think we're all part of the same picture, so we don't think soil sampling is better than remote sensing or vice versa. To get the true story and the picture of how your carbon is behaving, because carbon behaves over time and from 1 centimetre of soil to the next, it's important to use every tool that we can. And as John said earlier, we're estimating. No one can really measure soil carbon. You can never get the 100% picture. We're all estimating. So, Downforce is very collaborative and looking forward to working. We already work with people like Farm Carbon Toolkit. They take physical soil samples, we overlay our analysis, and we get to a better picture of how the carbon is behaving. And we look forward to the markets developing and helping landowners and farmers, sell credits, get to net zero, improve supply chains, etc. Sunlit uplands.